China Dissent Monitor, there were more than 900 protests in China between June and September 2024, led by workers and property owners. That's 27% more than the same period a year earlier. This sort of social strain as a result of economic grievances and an erosion of wealth will be a big concern for the Chinese Communist Party, and may explain why those GDP figures are so important to Chinese leaders.
So let me ask you, Jessica Klein in Malaysia, what's wrong here? Just talk us through why, when these GDP numbers aren't. No one thinks they're going to be good.
I'm going to share the truth that I think throughout my entire career, pretty much, Andrew, I've heard Chinese GDP is 5% for about 40 years. Okay? So it's kind of a special urban myth. They like that figure, but they do have terrible headwinds. So whatever, US sanctions, tariffs, etc., there's unfortunately demographics, which is also hurting them. So I think probably something like, at the moment, 15% of the population is over 65, right? But then if the economy is weak and it's hurting younger people, I remember watching a documentary about younger people being interviewed after graduating. They couldn't find jobs. They'd done civil engineering degrees. Someone was doing, apartment design, housing design, because everybody thought the property sector would be good. But they've now ended up as Grab delivery and Grab drivers and whatever. So it's quite a dark period, and I don't know the magic formula for China to leave all of this behind.
I was going to say, does anyone have any idea about how it can be fixed?
I think they're trying, and the measures will have to be bold. But the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, is going to struggle to quell dissent if numbers deteriorate. I don't know what the ultimate will be. Maybe they'll be so busy trying to cure themselves of their economic malaise, they'll stop eyeing all the islands, Philippines and Taiwan in the South China Sea. They'll have to concentrate on their own problems.
Story just breaking: China is sending its vice president to Donald Trump's inauguration next week. They want to get as warm a relationship as possible going there. Tell us about Country Garden Holdings, because this is a huge property firm in China. It's just posted losses of nearly $25 billion, which is almost a world record, not quite, but almost. What's happening with property in China?
It's keeping good company with some of the largest corporate bankruptcies around the world. I have seen, again, kind of urban legend stuff, blocks of residential buildings where plants are growing outside. There's huge, vast, empty towns. I think developers' finances are critical. And Country Garden's not far away. They had a development in Malaysia called Forest City, where they had anticipated 500,000 population, and it has, at a stretch, 5,000. And the last time I visited around the COVID period, I saw tumbleweed, Andrew, so it's scary. It might change now that Johor has got a special economic zone status signed with Singapore, and some people might pop in for, bargain hunting or purchases. But on the home soil, China is struggling as well with basically overdeveloping and finances not managed best they should be.
Another property story breaking as well about a company called China Vanke, which is listed in Hong Kong, where shares are expected to fall 8.5% today, Friday, because its chief executive is being detained by the authorities. So there are lots and lots of companies having different sorts of difficulties. Let's get the perspective of Dante Disparte in Washington on this. We're going to get what will be styled as poor GDP figures for China in the next few minutes, are they?
Well, it's interesting because one of the undercurrents, of course, of the incoming administration is economic nationalism, and the byline of U.S.-China competition is obviously two essential nations in the world competing with each other, but very codependent economies, both the supply chain side, the supply and demand side. But here in Washington, another thing we're watching of interest relating to China, of course, is the time ticking on TikTok. as an example of how this competition is playing out. That the U.S. Enterprise of TikTok has to be canceled or sold, and so there's a credible bid, the People's Bid, led by a group called Project Liberty, to buy that platform. And so that undercurrent is going to still matter, and whether China's economy starts to weaken, of course, a resurgent American economy is going to be a key competitive force that China has to reckon with as well.
We're going to get some kind of ruling on this from the Supreme Court, aren't we? Possibly even in the next 24 hours.
Well, that's right, and the original sort of timeline is that by the 19th of this month, either the platform has to be sold, or there has to be some degree of stay of execution, or a credible American group of buyers, which one exists, this People's Bid that I had mentioned, have to effectively take over the U.S. operations. And so continuity of this platform is in question, but obviously the idea that China is sending a representative to the inauguration is a good sign that diplomatic engagement will remain in this really critical global relationship between the U.S. and China.
This moment of the change of presidency being such a deadline for so many things, whether it's a ceasefire deal in Gaza or the sale of TikTok, does this always happen? Because I have to say I don't remember it being like this in previous situations where you've gone from one president to another.
Yeah, well, I'm actually writing an op-ed as we speak, titled Trump and the End of American Gradualism. And I think one of the things that in some respects is refreshing from this incoming president is that what he says he tends to mean, although what has been said thus far, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, territorial claims on Greenland, Panama Canal, and obviously this timeline for the hostage crisis to be addressed in the Middle East, all has so far borne fruit. And I think the idea, of course, of the United States coming first, no country around the world should take that as anything other than serious foreign policy. So we have to, get the U.S. economy going. I think that's the principal aim that the administration will have. But we cannot do that at the expense of every nation, let alone the expense of a lot of our allies around the world.
Let's talk about Apple now. After the iPhone is pulling its newly introduced artificial intelligence feature, basically tells you the news. It summarizes news notifications after it repeatedly got it wrong and sent users headlines full of mistakes. Live to Lily Jamalian, North America technology correspondent. Lots of news organizations not happy about this, though.
That's right, the BBC among them, but also organizations including the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I think the concern really is that we're already in a moment where there are real concerns about trust in news and making sure that credible news organizations can maintain that trust with viewers and listeners and their audience writ large, and that this feature, which kept malfunctioning, was really putting a dent in that trust. And the way that it worked, it would take many app notifications from one organization and package them together, and would effectively rewrite that as a preview in its own preview language, often turning out to be completely inaccurate, and it was labeled with the news organization where those headlines originated.
That's the issue, isn't it? Where if you then badge it with the original source, but you're publishing something that organisation would say, well, that's rubbish, we're not saying that at all. It's a problem. Just tell me a bit more about the mistakes that it made, just to sort of put this in front of our listeners.
Yes, well, in the BBC's case, there was a headline summary that sort of suggested that the alleged shooter in the United Healthcare CEO incident from I believe it was last month, that Luigi Mangione had killed himself, had shot himself. That turned out to be absolutely false. So that was then associated with the BBC. But it wasn't just us. There were other headlines. One summary claimed that the tennis star Rafa Nadal had come out as gay. That also was not true. And there were just a whole host of these mishaps, these headlines that, kind of were certainly going to grab the attention of the audience and make them and turn some heads. But again and again, there were enough of these that news organizations, went to Apple and said, this really needs to stop. And in the BBC's case, there was an effort to press Apple on this for multiple weeks. Only last week did Apple acknowledge that this was a problem. And so again, this issue had been surfaced back in at least December. Today, after this latest news that Apple is pulling this feature for now, the BBC, through a spokesperson, saying that we are pleased that Apple has listened to our concerns and is pausing the summarization feature for news.
And presumably Apple will be able to fix it. You know, it's a glitch in the software, and it can be resolved in some way, shape or form. By probably people cleverer than me.
Or me. Yes, and that is the idea, that they will have some time to basically push out an update that will make sure that this doesn't continue to happen. But, you know, in general, this is unfortunately the way a lot of things go in Silicon Valley, where there's a lot of pressure to ship product, to ship updates. And if you recall, when we covered the Apple product launch back in September, in Cupertino, California, where they are based, there was so much talk about Apple Intelligence, but then there was but you're going to have to wait a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, depending on where you live, for these AI features to make it to your phone, if you happen to have one of the more updated phones that supports them. So I imagine there was some pressure to move forward, even if some of these features were not ready, and that appears to be what happened in this case.
So it's interesting to know the sort of competition between the tech giants to get ahead of the game, but not get so ahead of the game when the stuff doesn't work.
Yeah, you know, it actually reminded me of Uber and Lyft. These are the ride-hailing services. The joke was, and this would have been, 10, 12 years ago now, that these companies, they don't ask for permission. They ask for forgiveness after they have done what they need to do, maybe broken a couple of regulations, broken some of the rules. They then say, okay, well, here's how we're going to fix it. And I think there is a little bit of that, you know, not more than a little. That is a real mentality that I think dominates in Silicon Valley. But it's one thing if that's, you know, the blowback is being taken on by the company itself. A different thing when a news organization, or multiple in this case, are having their reputations affected by these mistakes.
Lily, thank you so much. Lily Kamali's our North America technology correspondent, Dante Disparte in Washington. It's interesting, the AI thing. Each AI product feels like it's being tested out on us, in the world, on all of us, before they get it right.
Well, we have two choices, right? From a general policy down to technology, we could protect our economies from relevance in the 21st century by slow rolling the launch of these new technologies, or we could allow these imperfections to be addressed in the real world. I think the best defense we have against errant tech is well-trained people and well-trained drivers, right? And so, you know, AI hallucinating, we have to get used to it as part of a new normal, but over time the models indeed are perfecting themselves. And again, the keyboard in the chair, that space that we occupy is the best defense.
I mean, I suppose if you look something up online, it gives you an AI answer, and you often think, yeah, that's great, that's really useful, thanks very much. And sometimes you look at it and think, oh, no, that's not right. So I suppose it teaches us to kind of like